Hello. So, are Western leaders trying to start a major war against Russia? A lot of people online seem to think so. And so I was curious about this, so I started a poll on my Telegram channel where I asked the question, do you think that Western leaders are trying to launch a major war against Russia? Now, more than 750 people have answered so far, and 62% of them have answered yes. They do think that Western leaders are trying to launch a major war against Russia. And only 23% think that Western leaders are not trying to launch a major war against Russia. Now, obviously, my Telegram channel isn't representative of the public in general. And if we polled the public in general, I think we would have gotten a different result. But I still think that this is an indication of something. This is an indication of some kind about the beliefs in a certain section of the public. And I have to say the result surprised me for reasons that I'm going to explain in this video. And my friend Millennial Woes has talked about similar concerns. He posted an article called "The Grotesquerie of Our Warmongers" on Substack. And that was really the article that inspired me to record this video. And there he talks about the European leaders and military leaders who've said that Russia may attack another European country in the next 8 years or 5 years or 2 years, depending on who you ask. And this is his conclusion, and I quote, "Western leaders seem to be doing everything they can to make war against Russia happen. And not just war against Russia in Ukraine, war against Russia everywhere. We struggle to believe that our leaders would commit such evil and would actually want something so terrible, that is a world war, to happen. But I think they do." End quote. So that's a quote from the article. So he obviously interprets this talk in the media about the risk of Russia attacking other countries, interprets that as Western leaders want to attack Russia. That seems to be what a lot of people think about the discussion that's going on right now in the media. That Western leaders say that Russia may start a war, that means that Western leaders themselves want a war with Russia. That seems to be the reasoning that's going on here. So the question is that true? Will we actually see a major war between Europe and Russia in a few years? And is that what the European leaders actually want? So apparently a lot of people seem to think so. So let's have a look at what's going on here. Now, it goes without saying that I also want to avoid war, but I don't think that that's what our politicians want. I don't think that they want war. I think that there's something else that's going on here that's motivating these talking points. And in some sense, it may actually be worse than that. We're going to get into those issues. But I see no sign at all that they're trying to start a war. No sign at all. So what caused this discussion in the first place? Well, what caused it is that some leading military figures and some leading politicians in Europe have said that we have to prepare for war. And I'll give you just a couple of examples from the media. There are many more than these. One example from the UK, one example from Germany. The example from the UK is from the BBC. This is the headline, "Britain must train citizen army," military chief warns. Britain should train a citizen army ready to fight a war on land in the future, the head of the army has said. This is from January in the BBC. And similar kind of rhetoric in Germany. This is from the New York Post, also January. Germany preparing for Russia to start World War III, according to leaked war plans. All right. So, yes, the headlines suggest that we have to be ready for war in so and so many years. But the question is, why are they saying that? And it's not because they're going to start a war with Russia. Of course, they're not going to do that. Exactly the opposite. What they're saying is that if such a war would happen, then we would not be prepared for it. And here's the point. The point is NATO. The European security structure depends entirely on NATO. That means that our thinking about security issues is based on the belief that we are part of a big, strong security alliance, a big, strong defense alliance. And in fact, it's the biggest or the strongest security alliance in the history of the world. And so in theory, that means that we don't have to worry too much about being beaten up in an armed conflict. And the idea is that this defense alliance works like a team. And so each member doesn't have to be self-sufficient in the sense that they help each other. At least that's how it's supposed to be. So when you're a part of this team, you share the responsibilities, and that means that each state becomes stronger as a member of the team, but it also means that each state is weaker as an individual state. Because the division of labor means that you are stronger together but weaker apart. And so, essentially, we could say that the NATO, or the Defense Alliance, has kept down the ability of individual states because they depend on the alliance. So, in other words, the member states come to depend on the alliance. And so if the alliance doesn't work, they're skating on thin ice. They're in trouble, right? And this is where it gets interesting, because recent events in the last couple of years have shown that NATO, our defense alliance that we depend on, may not be as strong as we had expected, as we thought. And I could say a lot about how NATO has proven to be a lot weaker than most of us expected. But I'll give you just two examples. The first example, or the first issue, is that the US has stopped vital aid to Ukraine. The US has stopped military aid to Ukraine. Now, this signals to other members, or to the members of NATO, that the US is willing to ignore a security challenge against NATO in Eastern Europe. So that's the first issue. The second issue is about Donald Trump and the Republican Party, the Republican movement. And this is actually the bigger of the two issues, because Trump is most likely the next president of the US, and he has said that he wants to pull the US out of NATO. And that basically means shutting down NATO, because very few people believe that the organization could or would continue in a meaningful way if the US doesn't participate. The NATO is sort of a US organization, or a US-led organization. And Trump has also hinted that if he becomes president, the US may not fulfill its obligations to the other members of NATO. He's even encouraged Russia to attack other members of the alliance. And so, obviously, this sends a message to the other members of NATO. And the other members have received the message and they've understood the message loud and clear. And the message is that the US can no longer be trusted as a reliable partner in this security alliance, which means that the whole security alliance is in jeopardy, is in danger. And I want to note here that this is true even if the US doesn't actually pull out of NATO in a formal way, right? Because I believe that Trump will not be able to pull US out of NATO anytime soon in a formal way, because the American bureaucracy and the laws and so on will prevent that, but the damage is done anyway. The damage has already been done. The other members of NATO can no longer trust the US as a partner, and Trump can do other things to shut down NATO when he's president, other than pulling the US out of NATO in a formal way. So even if the US is still a member under Trump, in a Trump administration, he can still do things to shut down NATO in an informal way. And so the other members cannot trust a security alliance where the biggest, most important member is completely unpredictable like this. It goes without saying. It's their national security that depends on this structure, and the leader of this structure is completely unpredictable. That much should be obvious. That goes without saying. And so here's what you have to understand. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is the biggest security threat against NATO in its entire history since it was founded after World War II. So it's not only the biggest war in Europe since World War II, it's also a war directly on NATO's border, and the aggressor is NATO's main adversary. So in a way, it can be described as a war against NATO. A lot of people understand that. And considering that this is the biggest threat against, the biggest security challenge against NATO since it was founded, and the aggressor is NATO's main adversary, it's right on NATO's border. Considering all those things, NATO's response has been almost careless, almost reckless. And especially the US, which is the leader of NATO, has responded in a reckless way. And as a side note, another issue is that another NATO member, Hungary, is more or less siding with Russia against its own allies in this crisis. But that's a different discussion. We're not going to get into that, but it just adds another example that shows how weak NATO is right now. And the point is that if NATO does not respond forcefully to a challenge like this, then NATO cannot be trusted. Because an institution like NATO is built entirely on trust. It's not built on papers and bureaucracy. It's built on what people believe. That's where the power is. And if the members don't trust the alliance, then the alliance effectively does not exist, no matter what the documents say. And this is important because if the members don't trust the alliance, if the members don't trust the loyalty of other members and so on, then the alliance and the security organization falls apart. Now, I want to make clear that this isn't about American military aid per se. It's about loyalty and trust. It's about sending the right kind of message, right? So, because the EU and Europe is sending more aid to Ukraine than the US is, but there's an important difference. Europe is sending more financial aid and the US is sending more material aid, which is weapons and equipment and so on. And so without the military aid from the US, Ukraine is running low on weapons and equipment, and that's going to cause them a lot of problems, and has already caused them problems. Now, but that's as far as Ukraine is concerned, right? From their point of view, I'm sure that this is mostly about the equipment that they need in order to continue defending their country. But for the rest of Europe, it's a question of trust. It's a question of, can we trust the US? Because if they're backing down now from these promises, which they've given to Ukraine, and from the responsibilities in general to NATO security, then are we going to gamble on their loyalty in the future? I think the answer is obvious. So remember that the war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. That's a very important point. Because the war means life and death for the Ukrainians. For them, it's about the existence of their country. But for everyone else in Europe, it's sort of dress rehearsal. It's kind of a preview, right? It's about the players involved on the global stage. The players have shown their true colors. We know now where everyone stands, right? Because this test has shown what everyone is made of, their loyalties, and so on. So it's been an instructive experience these last 2 years. And so that brings us back to the beginning of the conversation. Why are European leaders talking about improving our military ability? Why are they talking about this big risk of war? Long story short, from a European perspective, the US is no longer a reliable partner in the security alliance. The US is too unpredictable. So our old way of thinking about security issues, defense issues, no longer works. And so, since these rifts have started showing up in our old, quote-unquote, old security order, we have to make new plans. And so, if we cannot trust NATO and the US, we have to start making plans about our security without them. And so, if you take a big player out of the team, if you think about this as a team, and if you take a big player out of the team, then you have to reorganize the whole team. You have to rethink the whole game, right? So in other words, Europe is now facing a new security situation with these two big changes. First of all, that the threat has gone up to the highest level since World War II. Russia has already attacked the biggest country in Europe. So the threat has gone up to the highest level since World War II. That's the first change. The second change is that at the same time as that happens, the biggest player on our own team has dropped out of the game. And this was also one of the big topics at the Munich Security Conference, which took place last week, a few days ago. And the Munich Security Conference is sort of the quote-unquote Davos of security issues. It is where the Western leaders meet to discuss security matters. And this year, one of the major themes was Europe without the US. And here's an example from Benjamin Tallis, who is with the German Council on Foreign Relations, and he's interviewed by Deutsche Welle.
And we had Donald Trump's former national security advisor on the program yesterday, saying that he was sure that under a second Trump presidency, Mr. Trump would, or President Trump would take the US out of NATO. Are European leaders, do you think, ready or indeed preparing for such a possibility?
They're not ready for it, and they're not properly preparing for it.
Should they be?
They absolutely should be, yes. It's not a question of formal withdrawal from NATO necessarily. NATO still has strong support in the US Congress, but any kind of war-fighting decision goes through the White House, and the sowing of the kind of uncertainty that Trump would undoubtedly bring renders our security guarantee uncertain.
Now, you can think what you want about this and about him or about any other person talking about it, but the fact of the matter is that this is how European leaders now are thinking about security issues in Europe. And I think they're right, because we have to change our plans for our security situation right now. And you can also hear other European leaders talking about the same thing. And so, hopefully, this can calm down some of the worries about the war. I said that in some sense, this may even be worse than the fears that others have expressed, but because this shows that we are sort of in a pretty messy situation. But the point is that Western leaders are absolutely not trying to start a major war against Russia. European leaders are trying to make the public understand that we have to change European security structure, and that this is a big deal. And so the reason that they're talking about it is that, one, it's certainly possible that a bigger war could happen, because wars take on a life of their own. Wars tend to escalate and get out of hand. That's one thing. The second thing is that if a war would happen, we would not be well prepared to deal with it. And I think we have to understand that we in the West, we in Europe, have been coddled since the time of World War II to think that it's almost unimaginable that a war, a major war, will happen in our part of the world again. But the thing is, it's not unimaginable. This kind of peace that we've had in Europe in the last 80 years, we've not had peace the whole time, but we haven't had anything like World War II at least. We had smaller conflicts. This kind of peace that we've had is not typical for history. And so we can't just assume that that kind of peace will continue. And so, I mean, even if there's only a small risk of war, you still have to be prepared for it. And in our current situation, with this new escalating threat, it would be irresponsible for European leaders to not prepare for the possibility of war or for the risk of war. It's not realistic to say that, just to speculate, right? It's not realistic to just speculate and say, I don't think this war is going to get out of hand and spread to other countries, so we can just safely act on the assumption that that's not going to happen. We don't have to worry about it. Because that only a child could think like that. That's not a responsible way of thinking. And so I think that it's to our politicians' credit that they're taking this issue seriously. Because, again, I think it's important to understand that our primary geopolitical adversary has already invaded the largest country in Europe. And so it's just unimaginable that the leaders of other European countries would just look the other way and say, this is none of our business, we don't need any precautions, because that's not really how reality works. So, to be clear, I see absolutely no sign of a build-up to a major war against Russia. Nothing like that is going on. We don't have, the Waffen-SS standing there ready to invade, waiting for the order. Quite the opposite. NATO has been remarkably weak and passive in this war, in the response to this war. Like I said, passive to an almost careless. They've been acting in an almost careless way. And so the West is not engineering a huge war. The actions of Western leaders are not consistent with them wanting a war, not at all. Western leaders are just trying to adapt to this new situation where the old security structure, NATO, is slowly splitting up, and they're realizing that maybe we actually need a security structure after all. And I have to add that, I mean, to be honest, you have to wonder about the politicians who think that we should not care about European security concerns. There's this almost childish, it's not almost, there is this childish mentality that, well, we can just think about philosophical issues. We don't have to talk about real world issues like actual physical security threats. I mean, of course we have to. That's just a part of reality. And we already have a major war in Europe. It has already started. And so we can just hope now that it doesn't spread to other countries, but we always have to be prepared that it could. There is that risk, there is that possibility, even if it's only a small possibility. But I actually think that that risk is actually greater than a lot of people realize at the moment. I'm going to talk about that in other videos. So the point is that all this so-called warmongering is not warmongering at all. It's not that they want war, that they're bloodthirsty. It's just a reasonable conclusion that we need to get serious about European security issues in this new situation. And really, the message is the opposite of warmongering, because these European leaders, these Western leaders, are saying that they're not prepared for war. And that obviously means that they're not going to start a war. That should go without saying. So I think the message you should take away from this is two major points. One is that Western security structure is a mess and is going to become even messier. It's going to become even more chaotic. So the West will absolutely not start a war. In fact, they're worried that Russia may start a war precisely because the West is not prepared for such a situation. And the second thing is that European countries no longer trust the US as an ally in security issues. That's not even speculation, it's an open discussion now. So European leaders are signaling to the people of Europe that we need to ramp up our own security structure. And I think that's absolutely reasonable, because we have to restructure things now that the old system is becoming defunct or obsolete. And so, in addition to these 2 points, I want to say that the war in Ukraine has also been enormously costly for Russia, both in material costs, of course, and in human lives. So it's completely unrealistic for Russia to start another big war right now. And so I think that, in other words, you can be quite calm, because no one actually wants further war. Not Russia, absolutely not Europe. And the US has already dropped out of the game, so they're certainly not going to push for war. And so I think that we can calm down this discussion a little bit, because I don't think that any of these parties want war. Of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't prepare for it, because wars tend to take on a life of their own, and they tend to escalate even without anyone actually planning so to begin with. So thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again next time. And if you want to help me make more videos like this one, you can send me a donation. Thank you for watching. Good night.